With Lecture 3, we're going to talk a bit more about the finer points of natural selection. We will specifically address this idea of heritability and how heritability kind of presents itself across populations. And we will look at this idea of whether behavior can evolve. And included in behavioral evolution is a discussion of evolved learning biases. Are there things that we are more prone to learn, things that we have difficulty learning? And so last lecture we discussed natural selection. We talked about the key criteria of natural selection. That is that we've got heritable variation. That heritable variation is then associated with differential survival and or differential reproduction. It doesn't have to be associated with both. It does have to impact at least one of those. We can thus define natural selection as the non-random differential reproduction of individuals. Well, what does this statement mean? What it means is that differential reproductive success, i.e., having different numbers of offspring, um, leads to those with higher reproductive success having a higher overall fitness and contributing proportionately more genetic material to future generations. So, having more babies leads to higher fitness. Now, of course, we know that it's not simply enough to have those babies. Those babies must go on and survive to reproduce. But in general, the best way for an individual to increase their fitness is through increasing their individual reproductive output. So we'll take a few minutes to discuss the ways in which natural selection can operate in a given population, the ways that it can change kind of population values of phenotypes. The first of these is stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection occurs when natural selection favors the mean expression of a trait and disfavors or selects against outliers. And so when we see stabilizing selection, it ends up over successive generations in populations with that have the same mean but have a smaller spread of variability. So we hold the mean constant, but we make the standard deviation significantly smaller. Populations are then more tightly clustered around that mean value. And we've seen this with human populations with respect to fertility and also within a species of hominins with respect to brain size. So, what do we mean by stabilizing selection for fertility? Well, when we look at hunter gatherer populations, people have on average 8 children. And we don't find very many individuals within the population who are able to reproduce at higher levels than about 8 to 10 offspring. And so, in general, those who have about 8 to 10 offspring are more likely to have greater numbers of those offspring than survive into their reproductive years and be able to go on and reproduce. Those individuals who have fewer than 8 children leave proportionately fewer uh, copies of their genetic material in successive generations. So reproducing below average is associated with a fertility cost. We don't find very many people, or a fitness cost, sorry. We don't find very many people who reproduce at levels greater than the average of about 10 offspring. And why is this? Well, it's because there's limits to the ways in which we can transfer or turn kind of food energy, calories, resources into reproduction. We have constraints associated with female reproductive success. And in particular, um, we are constrained by the very nature of the food resources. So within hunter-gatherer populations, it takes the combined work effort of both mother and father to be able to raise a family of offspring to maturity. And there's quite a bit of food sharing that goes on within the family, outside of the family. We just simply don't have the metabolism that we're able to a shortened gestation length, reasonably short interbirth intervals, etc., to be able to increase total reproductive output. So that this is how stabilizing selection presents itself. With respect to human brain size, we don't find very many outliers around a species typical brain size. So what does that mean? Well, modern humans have an average brain size of between about 1350 and 1450 cubic centimeters. We're talking about the volume of the cranial capacity. Individuals who are born with smaller than average brains tend to have developmental problems. They tend to have intellectual disabilities or challenges. Individuals who are born with larger brains also tend to meet some troubles. In particular, the way that we've got to fit the infant brain out of the birth canal during the birthing process. If brains are larger than a certain size, then babies are much more likely to get stuck in the birth canal, are much more likely to then either die in labor or lead to the death of both moms and babies. And so, with stabilizing selection, we've got the mean is, or the most common phenotype is usually favored. And so, successive generations result in populations with the mean that stays the same, but have a smaller spread of the outliers. The standard deviation gets smaller. There has been stabilizing selection on the Ache height. Remember, the Ache are hunter-gatherers in Paraguay, and they have an average adult male height of about 5'4", so considerably smaller than American populations, for example. Well, what would be the benefit of being about 5'4" if you're foraging in dense tropical rainforest? Individuals who are much taller than 5'4", let's think about the average Maasai height at 6'4", or let's think about somebody like Shaquille O'Neal. You're going to have trouble moving through dense tropical rainforests. You're going to be too tall to the point that you can't keep your steps quiet, that you get tangled up in undergrowth, etc. And that's going to influence your ability to hunt. You're going to scare prey away. You are going to you're going to not be able to pursue prey as quickly because of how you get tangled up in the undergrowth, etc. Individuals who are smaller than that average, let's say only like 4'5", are going to have a harder time keeping up, particularly if the pursuit of prey requires faster movement. And so we thusly see this smaller overall stature than other populations favored, but populations fairly clustered around this mean height. We've also seen stabilizing selection on the Kung interbirth interval. So the Kung are hunter-gatherers from southern Africa, Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, etc. When they were contacted in the 1950s, they were still free-ranging across the Kalahari Desert. They were still using stone tools to harvest their resources. And the Kung are notable among hunter-gatherer populations for their exceptionally long interbirth intervals. So the Kung, on average, most hunter-gatherer populations have an interbirth interval that's between 2 and 3 years. That means that the second offspring is born about 2 or 3 years after the first. The Kung, by contrast, have an interbirth interval of 4 years, and sometimes even longer. And so why? Why do the Kung have such a long interbirth interval? Well, it turns out that females do a phenomenal amount of work. And so there's a variable that we use to predict Kung interbirth interval called backload, which is literally the weight of resources plus the weight of offspring that Kung women are carrying on their back. And higher backload leads to a greater interbirth interval because it's a greater energetic or metabolic expenditure. And so what do we see with selection-wise with the Kung? Well, we see that survival of teenagers is definitely related to interbirth interval. So what does that mean? That means that individuals, babies born to mothers who have interbirth intervals of 4 years or more are more likely to survive to their teenage years. Those who are born to mothers who have interbirth intervals of less than 4 years are less likely to survive to their teenage years. But the other aspect here of interbirth interval is that if you make your interbirth interval too long, you're going to lower your overall fertility. And so, Kung women who have longer than 4 years of an interbirth interval also then have fewer surviving offspring, not because their offspring face a mortality cost to this interbirth interval. Survival is almost 100%, even if the interbirth interval is like 5 or 6 years. However, they're going to have fewer offspring over their reproductive career. So if you wait too long, you face an overall fitness cost in terms of having fewer offspring. We've also seen stabilizing selection on birth weight in babies. Most babies that do well are born between about 6 and 8 pounds. Babies that are born smaller than 6 pounds may have an increased risk of a NICU stay. They faced the possibility of higher mortality, particularly as we get to babies that weigh less than 4 pounds. Similarly, babies that weigh greater than 8 pounds can face a survival cost as well. These babies are more likely to get stuck in the birth canal and need greater medical intervention to be born. These babies are also more likely than to be born by C-section. And having a C-section raises your overall risk of SIDS, raises the overall risk of mortality for young infants. And part of that has to do with kind of a switch in the brain that is cut on during this process of laboring through the birth canal. And part of it has to do with the fact that babies born vaginally are inoculated with mom's microbiome. We have a vaginal microbiome, that is the bacteria and that we generally find naturally in women's birth canals. And babies that are born vaginally will open their mouth during the process of laboring down and swallow some of those bacteria. And that then seeds their digestive tract. It seeds their own microbiome so that they get the benefit of some of the healthy bacteria that mom is passing on through this birth canal, and so, or this birth process. And so, one way that that risk can be minimized if you have a C-section is ask for the doctor to do a vaginal swab, and then put that swab in the baby's mouth so that the baby is inoculated with your microbiome. Directional selection is another path that, or another way that natural selection can influence the population. This is where we favor one extreme or the other. We favor one end of the distribution, and so over successive generations, we end up with a population that has a mean shift. And so, if we are favoring the upper part of the distribution, we will shift that average value of the trait higher. If we are favoring the lower part of the distribution, we will shift that average expression of the trait lower. And so during periods of rapid environmental change, directional selection can even lead to adaptation. And so this has certainly been reflected across hominin evolution. We've gotten larger and larger brain sizes over the course of hominin evolution. And we've also seen a shift in stature and body size over the course of hominin evolution. So here's a graph that reflects this shift in brain size. Australopiths, including the genus Australopithecus and the genus Paranthropus, had brains that were only slightly larger than chimpanzees. Early Homo had brains that experienced a jump of about 200 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus had brains that experienced a jump of 200 more cubic centimeters. And then archaic and modern humans experienced about a 400 cubic centimeter jump in brain size. So over this course of about 5 million years that hominins have been evolving, we've seen larger and larger brain sizes. This phyletic evolution of the peppered moth is also seen as directional selection. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to the deposition of soot on these trees, the mean expression of the trait was such that there were many more speckled variants or peppered variants um, than there were the melanistic variant. Very abruptly after pollution put soot on the trees, we have a very rapid population shift to where most of the population then is melanistic, not this typical form or the peppered variant. And then thirdly, we see disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is rather rare in nature, but there have been some key traits that have evolved because of it. Importantly, differential gamete size between males and females. And so in disruptive selection, the mean is disfavored and both of the outliers are favored. And so this may be what we see with very extreme cases of sexual selection where females have one expression of a trait and males have another. This is what's at the root of the difference in gamete sizes between males and females. And so the fact that all higher taxa reproduce sexually, not asexually, hints at a really big benefit of sex, which we'll talk about as we start to address anisogamy. And so what this resulted in was, instead of this kind of typical bacteria-sized cell that would periodically build cytoplasmic bridges, that natural selection favored small motile gametes that carried very little information, very little material, but could swim very fast, and large passive nutrient-rich gametes. These are the eggs that kind of float around rather passively and just wait for these small motile gametes or the sperm to come meet them. And so gametes that were this medium size, this typical bacteria cell kind of gametes, then were disfavored. And sexual reproduction is the dominant form of reproduction really from reptiles on. So reptiles, mammals, birds, etc. We do see sexual reproduction also present in fish and amphibians. They are a little less obligate about it. They can reproduce asexually in certain cases. Insects also contain a mix of sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Here we have the bottom bullet point talking about the two morphologies of male orangutans. One of those morphologies of male orangutans is to be arrested in a subadult state where they look like females. The other is to go ahead and undergo the development of secondary sex characteristics and end up with these big cheek phalanges and fat pads and massive body size. And so what has been disfavored is males who start to progress through the development of secondary sexual characteristics but don't go all the way or kind of commit halfway. So males either don't develop or they develop all the way. There really is no in between. We've seen in the lab disruptive selection that is really able to lead to the divergence of two populations. We do a lot of genetic research with Drosophila or fruit flies. And the reason is that they have an intergenerational span of really only about 10 days. And so we're able to breed successive generations really in a relatively short period of time. And so we also are able to introduce genetic markers without the same kind of concerns that we have with higher taxa animals. And so we're able to get to measure a lot of change in a very short period of time. So here we're looking at the mean number of bristles that they have kind of on their backs. And we're able to, within 11, 12 generations, see two distinct populations emerge. And so in the wild, if we had two populations that had such a different number of scutellar bristles, we would classify those as different species. And again, looking at this information in a different form, the way that we select for high or low bristle number is literally by counting those bristles and only letting high bristles mate with high bristles and low bristles mate with low bristles. And we see this divergence of populations. And then this demonstrates to you the difference between a male who develops his secondary sexual characteristics and one who doesn't. Firstly, the male on the left is probably about twice the body weight. Orangutan fully adult males are on average 2 to even 3 times the body size of females. So larger stature and significantly heavier, but you also then see these secondary sexual characteristics. You've got the flanges, which are these outgrowths, these fat pads that come out from the face. And it may be hard to see, but he's got a fat-filled pouch under his neck as well that he inflates to be able to make his long call. And so some very conspicuous differences between these two orangutan male morphologies. The guy on the right has a morphology that's very similar to what females look like. So he's not the chosen sex partner because he doesn't have all of these elaborated traits, but what he's doing is reducing any kind of violent competition with the resident adult male.